You don't need any introduction, I know that, but none of your books has been translated into Turkish yet. So for the Turkish audience, it'd be really nice if you talk about who you are, your relationship with yoga, your publications, books, anything you think that's necessary about you.
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, briefly, I started studying the history of yoga informally, and then I went on to do a PhD in that subject at the University of Cambridge. I published a book called Yoga Body, which was about the modern reception and the modern kind of creation of a culture of postural yoga, which in some ways is quite different to what went before. So the kind of yogas that most people know and do now. And I've also published, I think, 4 edited or co-edited volumes of sort of scholarship on yoga, as well as a source book, you might say, called Roots of Yoga, which is really the primary texts of yoga arranged according to practices. So it's a very sort of practically oriented book. And what else to say? At the moment, I've just finished one book for Oxford University Press, which is an introduction to yoga, and I'm finishing another book for Penguin, which is about yoga and technology. And so that's about it in terms of academic stuff.
I'm really sorry, but I have to ask you this. What is yoga, and is the definition as open as it often presented to be?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was looking at some writing on that I'd done a long time ago this morning for this introductory book. And, sort of defining yoga depends on how you set the parameters. So if you look in a standard Sanskrit dictionary, for instance, you get lots and lots of entries, which I think for somebody today would have nothing at all to do with yoga, such as joinery, like carpentry, working with wood. There's political applications of yoga, which are very important actually through the history. So yoga is skill in doing politics. And so you have magic, you have lots of things that don't seem to suggest the kind of yoga that we do today. And then you also have in these list of dictionary definitions, the kinds of practices that we might think of as yoga today. So for example, spiritual practices, let's say, practices aimed at liberation from the human condition, which is what yoga has always been. But then again, you start to come up to it doesn't always mean that in the tradition either. It can also mean sort of the accumulation of special powers, yogic powers. So very much sort of going a different way than the sort of liberation and the spiritual way. And then you get into the modern period, and it starts to appear that a little bit that yoga is very much open to interpretation. It sort of means what anybody wants it to mean. It's associated most strongly, of course, with posture. I think when you say I do yoga, the image that people have in their head is of somebody doing stretching, balancing exercises, that kind of thing on a mat, usually on a yoga mat. So in modern times also you have this sort of twist away, because yoga has become, certainly in English, I'm sure in Turkish as well, it's become its own word. It's no longer a Sanskrit word, a bit like karma. It's sort of taken on this life of its own and started to mean something else in these very different cultural contexts.
Last time you talked about your methods, sources when you're doing your research about the history of yoga. Would you want to talk about that again?
Oh, sure. Okay, so you have various ways of finding things out, right? And making sure that they're true. Some of the ways of sort of finding out about yoga culture, let's say or yoga history, let's say through the accounts that are given of a particular lineage by that lineage, where you have these particular gurus that go back hundreds and hundreds of years. You have this sort of idea of this lineage, but you don't actually know what happened. You don't really actually know. You can't go back there. So the only ways of going back, of actually traveling in time to see what was actually being done in the name of yoga, would be things like archaeology, and there's quite a lot of that. So for example, sculptures of people doing postures or doing pranayama exercises or seated in meditation, and there's lots of them all over, some of them very, very, very ancient, especially the Buddhist ones. So that's one way in. That's a source. You can make statements that you know to be correct, roughly. You also have texts, that's to say things that are written down about yoga. So, I think everybody knows Patanjali, those sort of textual sources, there's lots and lots of them scattered around libraries all across India and elsewhere. And they also give you an important window, because if you can date the text, if the text says, usually at the end in a colophon, in a sort of note at the end, it says when it was written and where it was written. So there also you can see coming into view particular practices because yoga is an evolution. We see it developing. We see different practices coming to the fore at different times and different practices sort of receding. So at least there you can peg a date roughly and an order on that evolution. So you can start to see how things happen. Now, outside of that sort of longer historical perspective, you also have ethnography, which is going and talking to the people who do yoga about what they do and finding out that way. And then you plug into, the oral side of yoga, which is very important. And I think with the textual side, when the textual side dominates, it tends to push out this other sort of oral stuff. So you get an idea and sort of an ideal of what you think yoga is, which doesn't reflect what people were actually doing necessarily. So that other thing, even though it's limited by having somebody to talk to who's alive, not somebody from 300 years ago, but it does give you a sort of a very different sense of how those traditions might grow and evolve and actually be a bit looser and a bit more creative than you might think from looking at the textual record. And I think that's about it. So archives and, that's about it, really. Those are the three main ones, let's say.
I wouldn't think that oral tradition is that important. I wouldn't think that if you didn't mention.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's quite easy, especially now because of the way that yoga has been transmitted, often through a sort of high caste Hinduism, a sort of elite, let's say, and very much based on text and often based on Patanjali and not much else, as I think we discussed last time. You sort of get this idea of yoga which ignores really the people who are doing it, who are not necessarily high caste, not necessarily educated, don't have access to text, probably can't read, definitely can't read in many cases in the past. So you also have this on the ground sort of profusion of yoga, so-called vernacular yogas, which don't happen in Sanskrit, which is sort of the high language, a bit like Latin would be in in Christian countries or what it was previously. You don't have that. You have this living tradition, which in some cases is quite different. And I think that comes out. A colleague of mine, Daniela Bevilacqua, has done a lot of research with these yogis in India today. And of course, the picture that emerges is quite different than if you're looking at Patanjali or you're looking at the medieval yoga texts like the Hatha Pradipika, for example.
By the way, if you don't want to talk about purposely the things you talked before with me, please don't do that, because there's no, I deleted the recording before, so you can, you can talk to anything over and over again and it'd be nice. Okay.
Okay.
With knowing this, do you want to add anything to your answers or?
No, I think that's about it. I just, it seems to me that that's really important and kind of a new frontier, or at least it was sort of a new frontier in research. Well, why don't we just go and ask the yogis what they think? Sort of, and that sort of approach and sort of minor or local yogas, like local cultures of yoga, I think is so important, rather than thinking there's this thing that comes from India, it's called yoga and it's the same everywhere, which it isn't.
I asked you last time, where does the history of yoga really begin? And you gave me possible answers. If you had to choose one, I'm sorry, I have to push limits here. If you had to choose one, it can be a movement, a century, I don't know, a person, whatever, a text. Which one would you choose?
Yeah, I remember last time we talked about the Rig Veda, which, so from about 3,500 years ago, the sort of the most ancient foundational text of Vedic Hinduism, and the traces of yogis there. So, for example, this Keshin who can fly through the air and, has long hair, long sort of dreadlocks, like the traditional yogis, and so on and so on. And there's indications through those texts of this sort of culture. But the first formal sort of sets of depictions of practitioners and descriptions of practices of what people are doing in the name of yoga, called yoga, right, which it isn't necessarily in the Rig Veda, is going to be around 2,500 years ago, so about 1,000 years later than the Rig Veda's composition, with these groups of practitioners called Shramanas. And I think that's where we got cut off last time. So these Shramana means striver, somebody who strives, who's working, who's putting an effort in, which is, incidentally, there's a bit of an overlap there with the meaning of Hatha Yoga, because Hatha also means sort of forceful. Now, these practitioners, so for example, that includes Buddhists, the now modern religion of Buddhism, and Jainism as well, which is a religion that's still with us, but many more sort of, sects from within what we would now call Hinduism, practicing in a a way, doing things and thinking in a way that's quite unusual, that sort of seems to come out of the blue in this particular area of North India that one scholar calls Greater Magadha, the Greater Magadha area. Why it's unusual is because they have this idea about what life is. They think that life essentially is suffering, and that quality of suffering runs through everything, even what we might think of as enjoyment, because it's impermanent. And we're trapped by this because of a phenomenon called karma, which keeps us being reborn again and again into this cycle of life and death and suffering that's called samsara, words that also have passed into English, and I'm sure, are familiar to anybody listening. And so that was a sort of an existential problem. Why that came about is not clear. Some people have suggested that it might have come about through a pandemic, through the witnessing of terrible suffering, of people dying of disease everywhere, which may have come as a result of greater urbanization and the diseases that come as a result of that. So anyway, the name of the specific solution to that problem of life, suffering, rebirth, death, all of that, the name of that is yoga. Yoga is what you do to overcome that. And that's the basis of all ascetic yogas. So the kinds of ascetic yogas that you see at the Kumbh Mela, the great gathering of sadhus and sannyasins and yogis that takes place, the big one takes place every 12 years. And that's what yoga is. That's what yoga is for. And it's not for anything else. It's not for, reducing stress or, and any of those sorts of things we associate it with today. None of those therapeutic things, unless, of course, you think of therapeutic meaning that sort of escape from suffering by actually ceasing to be. So in a sense, it's a kind of total suicide. It's a total cessation of all activities of the brain, of all sort of identity, and of all your experience in the world. So it's quite radical, and I think, really quite useful and interesting to think of that, to know that, and to think of that with today's orientation, which seems to me quite the contrary to that, which is growth, holistic sort of, that holistic sort of idea of bringing things together and joining things, quite the contrary to those ascetic yogas of release and liberation as sort of escape from this world.
Has yoga always been ascetic? I'm asking this because I want to know the breaking points of, because it was at first ascetic and then it became what it is today. I want to know about where it really started to begin more earthly, more bodily.
Sure. I just wanted to say that the technique in those, even though there's more techniques that we know that later get sort of taken into yoga, but with the Shramana practitioners, the first mention of yoga as a specific technique is dhyana yoga, which is meditation. So thus linking, the meditation and yoga today together. And I think just to point forward a little bit, today those two things are often seen as separate, but they never were. So it sounds like maybe a kind of an overview, a sweep of yoga's history a little bit would be, I think what you're pointing to in your question is the arrival and the growth of tantric yogas, which starting from about the 5th century, so 1500 years ago or so, sort of make an entry onto the scene, and probably about the same time as Patanjali, in fact. So about the same time as these ascetic practices that we've been talking about get formalized into this text, which later becomes the foundational text, one of the foundational texts of the philosophical schools of Hinduism. So Tantra sets itself up as in opposition to Orthodox Hinduism, to Vedic Hinduism. It sort of offers itself as a quicker, better way to the goals that sort of sought after by ascetics or by within Vedism, you might say. It offers a kind of vision of the body that's quite different, as you were saying, I think, from the sort of body rejecting. Because of course, if you're an ascetic, your body's sort of something that needs to be cast off, that needs to be got rid of. So enlightenment, if you like, or kaivalya or moksha, that sort of liberation, when that happens, you're dead. And I'll talk a little bit later about embodied liberation as well, but that for the moment that'll do. That's what ascetic yoga is. That, but with tantra you have a different sort of idea. With tantra, it's through the body that you can attain these states, or whether that's moksha, or in the case of tantra, which is often involves a god. So the goal would be union with the god, or if it's a non-dual system, you become the god becomes you. And there's lots of tantric yoga practices that are aimed at facilitating that, actually, to making you no different than the god and the god no different than you. So the body in that sense is very, very much a vehicle for enlightenment, and as is enjoyment. So, with the kind of bleaker ascetic view, let's say, of the body as an impediment and desire as an impediment and so on, you get a sort of tantric perspective on that. I'm generalizing a lot, but which would be that you can use the body and you can use desire. So famously through sex, there's an element of that. Unfortunately, it's sort of become, when you say tantra these days, it often has those associations of sort of enlightened sex and stuff like that. But it's far, far, far more than that. And there's really a lot of scholarship on this over the last 20 years. So if anybody's interested in that, there's plenty of sort of really good stuff on that. So that would be tantra. Maybe I'll just sort of continue on to see how those two streams come together a little later, from about the 11th century onwards. So 5 centuries later, when tantra is massive, right? Tantra has sort of exploded not only within India but in other countries. So and we had tantric kingdoms until not that long ago. So I think Bhutan is the only one left, but Nepal and Tibet. And, so Tantra was huge. That sort of approach became huge. It doesn't mean that the other one went away, the ascetic kind of approach. But they come together in medieval Hatha Yoga, which is a practice which is kind of a simplified practice that draws from ascetic yoga, so practices like tapas, austerity of the body, and tantric practices, and which joins those two, sometimes in a kind of uneasy alliance, but brings those two streams together into a practice that's based on originally body practices called mudra, which are seals for sealing the kind of energies and winds that circulate in the body. So they're not asana. And pranayama practice, which is fundamental to Hatha Yoga. It's the foundation, you might say, but also including asanas. At first, very few. So 3, say, 1 or 3 asanas, usually something like Padmasana for sitting down, lotus pose, just for sitting and staying still. But later that becomes a little bit more elaborate, and you start to get an expansion of postures through the later half of the millennium. So that's it. What else to say? And Hatha Yoga, of course, actually from quite early on brings in this therapeutic element to yoga, which wasn't there before. So the idea that these yoga practices can cure diseases, and you see it all over the Hatha texts, like the Hatha Pradipika. Doing the peacock pose will destroy any kind of gastric problems and so on and so on. So that's up to, that takes us up to about 1500 or something, or a bit later.
What happened in 11th century was, correct me if I'm wrong, Amrita Siddhi?
Yeah, which is the earliest text that...
of Hatha Yoga.
So actually, this is how the research went, and this is referring to the research of James Mallinson, my colleague. If you look at the Hatha Pradipika, which is the sort of the final, the sort of Bible of Hatha Yoga, you might say, I think only 75 verses out of 300 and something verses in the text are by the author, the so-called author of this Hatha Pradipika, who's called Svatmarama. The others come from other places. So the work then is to, in a kind of textual philological sense, is to find out what those texts are. And the earliest text from which many of those later verses, which become Hatha Yoga, are drawn, is a Buddhist text called the Amrita Siddhi, which is precisely the text, the sort of the earliest text of what we might call proto-Hatha Yoga, which bases itself in these practices called mudra.
Has there ever been a fully secular yoga tradition before 20th century?
No, that's funny. I was writing about this morning, funnily enough. I mean, I think the obvious example of that is a sect called the Charvakas, who are a materialist sect. That's to say, they don't believe in anything apart from the here and now. They don't believe in reincarnation. They don't believe in a sort of higher metaphysical reality. They obviously don't believe in God. What you've got is this body and this world, and when you die, you die. So it sounds a lot like the sort of 20th century sort of scientific viewpoint, the predominant one anyway. But it means that it's not entirely clear why somebody from that sect, a Charvaka, would want to do yoga. And in fact, there's no evidence that they did, except that in a much later Hatha Yoga text called the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, The Charvakas are mentioned as part of a group that does yoga. But why, at that point, anybody would even consider doing yoga if they didn't believe in anything like reincarnation or any sort of superpowers or, anything beyond the rational, material, empirical world is not clear. So I think probably the answer to your question is no. No, the 20th century is the first time, or 19th century anyway.
I ask this because there's a claim that modern yoga postures, I'm underlining this, modern yoga postures can activate or open or trigger specific chakras or elements. I'm referring to the common tendency in modern yoga to associate particular poses with the stimulation of certain chakras or elemental energies, whatever, fire, earth. Do you think this claim has any solid historical or theoretical foundation? They are doing this with modern yoga postures.
Yeah, I have my doubts. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out that you find a yoga text where it says that, by doing, we were talking about the peacock pose, you stimulate Manipurna chakra, at the navel. Things like that wouldn't seem to me that may well happen. Or it could anyway. I wouldn't be very surprised. So I don't know. Certainly that there's lots of strange ideas about chakras. The chakras have had a life of their own in modern yoga, that's to say. And they were at one point extremely fringe. They didn't exist in yoga until later Hatha yoga, when they sort of started to take on a new popularity. But they weren't always there. And of course, there's in some systems there's 3, in some there's 4, in some there's 15, and in the most well-known one there's 7 or 6 plus 7. This one, and they have all sorts of things added onto them. So although that sort of example you say strikes me as one of the most reasonable, really, when you look at the other ones, sort of filtered through psychotherapy, Carl Gustav Jung was super, very interested in those, and of course interpreted them according to his theories, and sort of New Age theories of the chakras as the seats of emotions. Those seem to me much more sort of way off the sort of the idea of chakras. And if I can just say, if it's not too much, that the chakras were understood as imagined into being. They were ritually brought into being. They weren't things that actually existed in the body. They weren't physical originally. They were sort of focuses for meditation. So that transformation into the idea of chakras as being something and somewhere actually in your anatomical body, I think is quite a predominantly modern one anyway.
What was the harmonial gymnastic movement? Why are modern yoga postures not a direct continuation of traditional Hatha yoga?
Well, harmonial gymnastics is my term. I invented that term. So it sort of doesn't exist. It didn't exist before I brought it into being. And what I meant by that was something really, really quite interesting. And at that time when I was writing about it, quite overlooked in the European and American traditions of in sort of unchurched Protestantism. So Protestant sort of freewheeling, more or less Protestant people who aren't controlled by the church, who don't look to any authority, but look to their personal relationship with God. And in particular women, because this is a women's tradition in the US as across Europe, actually. It was what became very popular was that through rhythmic movement and the exercise of the breath, so particular rhythmic breathing and particular kinds of breathing and particular kinds of bodily postures, you could gain a direct sort of channel to God, or to, if depending on what you believe, to the greater, the forces of the cosmos, and open yourself to that. And there are lots of those sort of spiritual gymnastic traditions which don't, even though it sounds a lot like yoga, don't have, as far as I can see, any causal link to yoga at all. Now, what happened as yoga became known, especially in Europe and North America, was that these harmonial gymnastics traditions, where predominantly women practitioners, started to merge with these sort of Asian, Indian sort of yogic ideas of liberation through the body. So like Hatha yoga type stuff, and tantric type stuff as well. And to become so merged that they become eventually indistinguishable. And it seems to me this is sort of that's what yoga plugged into. It didn't when it sort of came west. It didn't just land there. There were things that looked like yoga, and it sort of, I think, plugged into them. And my theory, actually, from my 2010 book Yoga Body, is that the dominance of women practitioners in yoga yoga culturally can be explained by this other tradition of harmonial gymnastics, because of course yoga traditionally in India has been largely, but of course not exclusively, the domain of men. So why that should be, why this should be a thing that women would practice primarily, I thought that was at least one explanation.
When we are talking about liberation, moksha, nirvana, whatever, I don't want to oversimplify anything, but let me ask you first, have you ever studied the neuroscience of it? Do you know anything about what's going on through brain? I think it would be really nice if you talk about those stuff, because as far as I know, like I said, I don't want to oversimplify or disrespect any of the practices. As far as I know, it is the malfunctioning of brain through long hours of breath work and meditation. By the way, I'm not saying that this is not useful or anything. I'm extremely curious about that experience. I never experienced something like that. Would you want to talk about the science behind it, what they call as liberation moksha, if you're interested?
I am interested. It's part of my topic at the moment. This book about yoga and technology has actually, two chapters on neuroscience. And so what we're talking about here is the so-called neural correlates of yoga practice. That's to say, the kinds of the parts of the brain that light up when you do a particular practice, when you do a pranayama practice or you do a deep meditation. And this sort of research started happening quite early on, I think in the 80s, but really sort of took up speed within the 2000s with the Mind and Life Institute and studying particularly Tibetan yogis doing deep meditation. And this is Daniel Goleman and what's his name, Davidson, who sort of started all this. And the idea there was that if you could get a meditator with an EEG at the time on their head, you could find out what happens in the brain when you go towards these deep meditation states, these deep yogic states. And so what you get is neural correlates. And that has sort of, I'll say what the consequences of that. I think that has become dominant explanatory framework for what yoga is and does over the past at least 10 years. So there's all sorts of books. There's lots and lots and lots of scientific articles on yoga and meditation now. And it's sort of come into the popular domain as well. So you have, I don't know if it's true to say particularly in America, but certainly there, within the Yoga Alliance and stuff, you have lots of sort of workshops and classes that are guided by what I call neural yoga, by neuroscience. So it's all very interesting. I think what it tends to do, and here we're back once again to the Charvakas, what it tends to do, because neuroscience is science, and because science has sort of, in the form of what I call scientism, that's somebody else's term, but has tended to reduce everything down to the brain, to reduce everything down to the materiality and the biological and electrochemical functioning of the brain. So we have a situation once again where that sort of dominant idea that the material is all we've got takes over. And what that does, in my opinion, is harmful, or at least it's inaccurate with regard to what yoga actually is. So of course, you can trace all these things, you can map it, and you can even, and this is the new frontier in neuroscience, you can even, instead of just watching it with the EEGs and things, you can put in brain stimulation, you can put in ultrasound stimulation or transcranial magnetic stimulation in order to elicit this, or you can take smart drugs to elicit these states of consciousness. So you're reverse engineering yogic states in order to stimulate them with technology. But I think what all this overlooks is that, let's say from classical yoga, from the Sankhya philosophy of yoga, is that all of that is, in their terms, prakritic. It's prakriti, it's material. It says absolutely nothing about purusha, the other half of the other side of the coin, you might say, of the spiritual. Everything that is beyond the merely material, or within it, in fact. And it depends a bit on your philosophy, whether you're following this dualistic Sankhya philosophy or Advaita Vedanta. But it seems to me that all agree that this is merely either an illusion or just really part of the story. So it's great, it's all very interesting, but it doesn't sort of orient us towards that, the important sort of aspect of what yoga is for, whether it's liberation or experiencing communion with the divine, or a union with God, unless you define that communion with God as a purely neurological event, which people do. There's a book called Spirit Tech that was written a few years ago, which is very much goes into all this sort of stuff, which seems to me does exactly that. It's very easy to get sucked into that, and suddenly you're in the world of neuroscientists and you can't get out.
I heard that people are talking about those psychedelic experiences just like exactly what happens during meditation. Like there's almost no difference between the experiences.
Well, that's a long story.
Yeah.
The use of intoxicants and drugs, yeah, stop me when you get bored. But like in the ancient past, you have in the Rig Veda, I mentioned this drink. I don't know if it was this time or last time that people used to drink during these Vedic rituals, which would give them a kind of heightened sense of the ritual and would enable them to be in touch with God, basically. And of course, is another name for these psychedelic drugs, and modern update. You also have in the Yoga Sutras, you have mention of this practice called Oshadi, which means herbs, and those herbs, presumably are psychoactive herbs. You have the ritual use of everywhere in ascetic groups, I should say, in India. And the whole psychedelic thing, because it's kind of a modern phenomenon, comes into the history of modern yoga, and particularly, not for the first time, but particularly strongly in the 1960s, of course, with the counterculture and the hippies in America and Europe and everywhere. And that sort of idea, that cultural idea that yoga is just like taking is extremely I think starts there and gets extremely strong because of people like, oh God, what's his name? Turn on, tune in, drop out. Timothy Leary, who said that, who called his consumption of yoga. If you look at his book, that early book, that's how he does it. He's always talking about it's yoga, and he's not doing asanas. He's doing. And there is lots of, because it was so prominent, because that idea was thrown out there so strongly, and because there's legends about, Indian gurus taking and not being affected because there's this sort of cultural idea that they're the same thing. I think a lot of people understand it like that. What was my point here? Oh, but there's also a lot of pushback. There's also a lot of teachers, sort of saying it really isn't. It really isn't the same, and you can get into an awful lot of trouble if you think it is. So there's books full of There's some really interesting sources on that, actually. I think it's worth taking that into consideration.
What are the risks of blending yoga with New Age ideas? What are the most common misconceptions modern practitioners or yoga studio goers tend to hold? What can modern yoga instructors do to communicate yoga more responsibly?
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't know if I can talk about what's wrong, because that implies that I know what's right. I think in some ways modern yoga has had the history that it's had and the transformations that it's had because of the particular needs of the cultures where it's landed. So it grows up in response to those. There's good and bad in that. There's sort of a double-edged sword, because in one way, of course, yoga responds to what people need or think they need. Somebody in 500 BCE northern India, who's just witnessed the most terrible pandemic where everybody's died and is convinced that the world is suffering, is going to sort of come up with a different yoga to meet those needs than somebody in 20th, 21st century Turkey, I imagine. So it's understandable why things change like that. But at the same time, with yoga's sort of traveling out of India, with its circulation around the world, you've got a kind of pace of change and a kind of radical nature of change sometimes that sort of make you've got to question what's going on. One of the things you mentioned, New Age, that's another sort of scholarly construct that nobody refers to themselves as New Age, at least not these days, I don't think. You have those sorts of ideas from different religion, a New Age religion, coming into what were previously not those kinds of religious ideas. So religious ideas from within Hinduism as a whole, or Buddhism, or Jainism, or even Islam, because Islam has a very close and extremely interesting relationship with Indian yoga from many hundreds of years. So with the New Age, things start to look a little bit different. You have different beliefs about why you do yoga, what you're doing when you do yoga, and many of those sort of traditional ideas disappear. We've already talked about the chakras, the sort of New Age chakras and things like that. So some things disappear and some things come into being. I don't know, sort of saying I'm not really qualified to say sort of what's good and what's bad. I just sort of look. Anything that calls itself yoga, I look at and I try and see what it is, where it's coming from, why it's like that, without going, that's bad, that's good. Although I'll say one thing, that a lot of the strangest changes in yoga have come about, I think, because of its insertion and assimilation into capitalist system. So into neoliberalism, into systems of consumer desire, where the spiritual, anything spiritual, of course, as everybody knows, yoga is spiritual, whatever that means, where the spiritual becomes a commodity to be sold. And that, I think, has had, some kind of harmful effect. I don't know what to say, really. It's certainly had a profound effect on yoga, and it has changed it in many cases beyond recognition, for the reason that the free market requires innovation in order to sell. In order to sell yoga, you have to come up with something that's new. You have to come up with something that's popular, that nobody else is doing, and you have to try and corner the market. So that's yoga responding to sort of the market conditions, rather than yoga evolving through, let's say, a slow and ongoing philosophical conversation that happens over hundreds and hundreds of years. Different kind of thing.
I think the biggest problem is, while its teachings constantly promotes an ascetic lifestyle, a spiritual lifestyle like Buddhist or Patanjalist approaches, but when you look at what's being marketed, at the same time, it's posture focused retreats or yoga camps, whatever, like it's so earthly. I think this makes yoga so incoherent. I think we need really strict, a solid, structured curriculum when it comes to yoga teacher trainings. That's what I believe. And I think the things I just mentioned causes yoga to be a really shapeless, incoherent, and that's how you exploit people, because at some point you reach a level that you can market and sell anything as yoga, any bodily practice, any type of meditation, any breath work, any retreat camp, whatever. You can start to sell anything, and you have reasons to do that. Like this is how you exploit people. I think Christopher Wallace has a video on this, saying that I think the biggest irony in the modern yoga, in the yoga teacher training, is that they are studying Patanjali.
I really can't comment on any of that. Like what's wrong with yoga culture, really. I mean, I think, Chris Wallace's point is well made, although I think maybe he's a bit biased in favor of Tantra, which is in many places explicitly anti-Patanjali, anti-classical yoga, Hindu yoga. So I think maybe it boils down to authority. Like you're talking about the sort of a looseness that anything goes. Yoga can be whatever you want it to be. You can go to the Bahamas for 2 weeks tomorrow and come back a yoga teacher, and that nobody is in charge. Nobody's in charge of anything. It's just out of control. So I mean, what do you do about that? I mean, who makes up that curriculum that you're describing? I mean, some schools have extremely detailed and very difficult curriculums. Iyengar yoga for one, but who's going to do that? I mean, in traditional yoga, you never do yoga. Yoga does not happen ever without a guru. Do you start to bring in gurus? Well, that's been tried, and there's been many failures on that level, and many cases of abuse and so on. And somehow it has never seemed to quite work, because the guru institution isn't something that culturally is known, at least in sort of North America, Europe. So what do you do? That's the problem. How do you know who should be in charge? Institutions and organizations like the Yoga Alliance try to do that. They try to sort of get a curriculum. They try to sort of make things standard. But I mean, who's deciding? That is the problem. I don't think you'd have this problem. You wouldn't have this problem if you were an ascetic that belonged to a particular sampradaya, an organization, religious organization in India. It's all worked out for you. So we're in a situation where it's very hard. It's very hard to know what to do. Simply imposing sort of a curriculum. I don't know if that's the answer, but certainly the yoga is anything you want it to be model is a little questionable.
You are probably aware that I'm extremely nervous because I don't get to talk to Mark Singleton every day. And you have no idea how many yoga teachers I have emailed before you in Turkey who I thought qualified to do this. And I got no replies at all, only declines, couple of declines, and that's it. And I emailed Mark Singleton and you accepted it, which is crazy, which is unbelievable. Like, because there's no one above you in this field. And I'm so grateful to do this. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to talk. And it was a very nice email. So
yeah. Do you want to add anything? Do you want to mention anything? Do you want people to know about anything before you go?
No, just to say, I mean, it'd be very nice to get those books, some of the books translated into Turkish as well, if anybody's out there.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you very much. Great to
Take
talk to
care.
you.